My next guest on Founder FM is going to show us how to turn a skill into a business. Let's say you're a lawyer or a pet grooming specialist, or you know how to fix iPhones. Grant Weherley is founder of Monetize Your Expertise. He helps people do just that by turning their skill into an online course. That's good timing because it's something I've been thinking about here on Founder FM. How can I turn my skills from 20 years of working as an entrepreneur, starting and growing businesses around the world, into a product that could actually help like-minded people? Most people balk at the thought of creating an online course. It looks like a lot of work, but it doesn't have to be so. With the right preparation, you can get going sooner than you think. Grant reckons you can be up and running in as little as 10 hours. In this interview, we discuss how. We discuss the how-to of course creation, how to create a course, how to test your ideas before you launch, how to find customers for your course, how to maintain it once you've created the course. It's a good 101 for anyone interested in getting their foot on the first ladder of course creation. So listen in and find out how to take that skill you're good at and monetize your expertise with me, Graham Brown, and Grant Weherley on Founder FM.
Founder FM. You're listening to Founder FM with your host, Graham Brown.
Hello and welcome to Founder FM. My name's Graham Brown. This is the voice of the entrepreneur. Today I'm going to introduce you to Grant Weherley from Monetize Your Expertise. Let's say you have a skill, a book, a blog, or a podcast. Have you ever thought about turning that into a course? I certainly have. Well, the man who's going to help us understand how to turn your ideas and your expertise into a course is going to walk us through, give us some examples, tell us what we need to do, and also some of the pitfalls that we can avoid. He's going to show us how you can turn your expertise into a course in as little as 10 hours. So that's a promise I need to take him up on. Grant, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Excellent to have you here. Let's start with the idea of courses in the first place. What's so good about online courses?
I think some of the biggest things, I mean, you got the sort of nice, flashy blog post titles. It's like, make $100,000 in, 12 hours or whatever because you do a course launch, right? That's awesome. But the bigger concept, I think, with regards to courses is that a lot of times people are a consultant or like an author, or they do all these other things, and courses are a great way to monetize a lot of different things. So for example, say, this is kind of a real example. You're a lawyer and you work one-on-one with clients, and hey, you want to like package that information up into a packaged course and sell that instead of your time, right? You don't want to trade your hours for dollars. Well, courses can be a great way to do that. And oftentimes it's also a great way to take something that already exists, like for example, your podcast, Founder FM. You can take that and, leverage that further by also taking that and selling it as a course as well.
So that's interesting, isn't it? So what you're suggesting is that for a lot of people out there, they have the content already. They have the ideas and the content. They're not having to create new stuff. I think people look at courses as something that might be quite complicated. How do I get started? I have this idea about a course, but where do I start? Let's look at an example then. You mentioned Founder FM. It has crossed my mind that this could become a course at some stage. Where would you start with that? We've got this audio out there. We've got a website. We've got an email newsletter. When you look at that, where would you start?
Yeah, so you could do a couple different things. One thing that you could do is have, a really cheap VA go in and sort of transcribe it and pull out common themes that you could turn into like the more structured course content. Also, interviews themselves are very compelling and a great addition to any course. Sometimes you can have a course mostly made up of interviews, but it's more of usually in like the bonus interview section with additional case studies, right? So you could take the audio, pair it with some video or slides or whatever, and then you've got your entire bonus section already finished, right? The hand-selected interviews, say you've got 50 interviews, you pick the top 5, boom, that's your bonus content. You transcribe and pull out the common themes from the rest of the 50 interviews, and then all of a sudden you have this really easy starting point, the starting outline to be like, hey, based on interviewing 50 world experts, this is the most common sort of path to being successful as an entrepreneur. It can be very, very easy going from that route. And again, it's actually super cheap to get a VA to transcribe things. You can get an editor. But one thing I do want to say is that the whole online course thing is sort of painted as like a very easy thing to do, and it doesn't have to be difficult, but I also want to be clear that it's usually more difficult than what most people think, because there are things like, how do you create the slides? How do you edit the videos? How do you write the scripts? How do you host the content? How do you have a paywall? How do you run a webinar? Like there's like a really long list of things you got to know how to do. And that's where people oftentimes run into trouble, is because they forget all the other stuff aside from like, ooh, I want to make a course.
Right. There's a lot of moving parts, as you say, right?
Exactly.
Well, I'm interested because I think some people may look at a course and say, well, hang on a second, all this stuff I put out there free anyway. I'm publishing these podcasts, or I'm writing these blog posts, or whatever that we may be doing in terms of content. Why would people then pay for that packaged up as a course?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And there's two things I want to say to that. Number one, the simpler example is if you've ever gone to a website, like a blog that you like for example, I know Video Fruit does this because I've seen it and he's talked about it. If you opt into his website, there's like, get this free case study that's da-da-da-da. And all it really does is it's like some kind of free course, which is a series of blog posts which are already published on his site, right? So there's a sort of principle there, which actually had a really interesting discussion in a couple different places with people sort of talking about the differences between like paid courses and free courses, because there's free courses offered by places like Stanford, right? And so a friend of mine, he works at MIT, and he was just like, why do people have paid courses? Because you can have free courses from Stanford and MIT. And so it's a really interesting concept. We had a great discussion, and really what it comes down to, whether it's a free course on somebody's blog where they opted in, or it's a paid course elsewhere, right? So the service that you're really paying for is the packaging up and marketing of information. So it's like finding you where you are when you need to find this information, putting it very nicely packaged in front of you. Now, it's also true that you can find you can piece together the free content for basically any course if you put enough time into it. But realistically, nobody's really going to do that. And that's kind of what you're paying for, is the convenience of it, the structure of it. And a big part of the value of a course is not only what you include, but also what you like, separating the noise of stuff that you should not pay attention to. And that's a huge service to people as well.
Right. Very good point. A lot of people have content that they're pushing out there, whether it be blogs or podcasts, or whatever. But to package it up, you're basically saying, hey, look, focus on this part here. And that's where you can kind of get more specific with the themes. Let's say with my podcast, you could take a specific theme, like, how to start a business or how to raise money for your startup, for example, as a specific theme. There may be 50 podcasts out there, but, you're going to go in and you're going to handpick 5. You're going to package it. You're going to give it some kind of, extra content in the course and so on. And you're actually reducing the content that people are looking at, but you're increasing the value because, you're saving them time and you're helping them focus. I think a key part of this as well is you're kind of hand-holding, aren't you? And helping people understand this is what you need to look at and this is what you need to ignore. And I think that removes the decision-making process and, makes it a lot clearer for people in terms of, what do I need to focus on? What do I need to learn, and so on?
Absolutely. And it's actually quite similar to people who might have a blog and then they write a book that's pretty much the same topic as the blog. The book goes more start to finish. It's more, it's structured differently. Like it goes a lot deeper. It connects things together, and it's a lot better experience. And therefore you can charge for it, even if it's only $10, right? And courses are a step beyond that. But if you can go start to finish and just read a book versus like browsing a blog for a very long period of time, trying to piece together all the information that you need and like find out what's irrelevant, what's relevant, it's just a huge value to bring to people. And that's why, there's courses out there people charge thousands and thousands of dollars for just one course, right? So it's definitely a valuable service, and the prices range from $0 to like $4,000 or $5,000 for courses.
Right. So we have Book in a Box by Tucker Max, who's a guest on our radio show shortly, and yours is more or less Course in a Box. So how does that work? I mean, explain to me, let's say I'm a guy running a podcast. What would then happen? I'm kind of thinking about this course thing, but it's always secondary. It's always in the back of my mind because, I've got to do these interviews. I've got to do the production. I've got to do, this other business that I'm involved in. How could you then sort of take that to the next step? Because there's a big bridge there, isn't there, between thinking about something and action, turning that into a course. What's the course in the box idea?
Yeah. Essentially, it's taking all of the work away from it as much as possible. So there's a couple different routes depending on if the person has a podcast, a blog, a book, or just sort of maybe a consultancy where the knowledge is in their head. And that one's most like the book in a box type model where it's more interview based, pulling out the information. But a lot of times, for example, we're finishing up a project right now, which is a book that just launched, and we're turning the book into a course, right? So the course is launching on the back end of the book as well. And what we did was we took the book, and we didn't even have to upfront interact at all with the person who wrote the book, making it very seamless for them. They didn't even have to think about it. They just knew it was getting done. We turned the book into scripts, into slides, into videos, edited the videos, packaged it all together, produced it into a finalized course. And all he had to do, and this was by his own preference, was read the scripts and record it. And that's all he had to do. It took him a couple hours, and that was all the effort he had to put into the entire course, right? By contrast, I know people who've spent, 6 months, a year, several years sometimes, because they just keep getting stuck because there's so many moving parts. They're like, oh, I'm not sure how to structure this. I'm not sure what content to include, what to not include. I'm not sure what to title it, how much to price it, where to put it once it's done, if it's even a good idea at all. I'm kind of questioning that, right? So there's a lot of barriers people run into when they start this kind of thing, which is kind of what gave rise to that kind of service that we offer, because so many people were looking for that kind of thing.
Very interesting. What kind of money could you make out of that kind of course? Without giving specifics of specific example people and so on, give us a range of what's realistic and people can turn their, it might not be through your service, but generally turn their expertise into a course.
Yeah, well, there's a wide range in terms of outcomes of courses. Of course, there's for example, on my podcast, you can check out an interview I did with Danny Iny from Firepole Marketing, which was rebranded as Miracy. But anyways, it's Firepole Marketing on my site. He describes I believe it was $2.6 million course launch, right? And you got people like Ramit Sethi doing the same thing, like multi-millions of dollars, right? That's the high end. Of course, not everybody's there. But what's also very common, and this is the more realistic number. That was the aspirational number. But here's the realistic number, which is that a lot of people, and this is kind of like the first time they're doing it, first course, they just do it more or less kind of right. And they can do a pretty good initial launch. And, they're like, hey, I want to build this course. And I have this email list of 1,000 people. So they float the idea past their email list. They're like, hey, I'm trying to build this course. If I build it, will you buy it? Here's the buy button. And then they can make $10,000 in pre-sales before they've even made it. Right. And then there's, in between. And then there's also the sort of third category, which is the people who kind of go off on their own in their entirely own direction and never. And this is actually one of the biggest mistakes of course creators, which is they get in their head, they want to make a course and they're very excited about what they want to make the course on. They're just like, oh, this seems like an awesome idea. I'm really excited about this. But they completely forget about the fact that you should also validate your ideas before you execute on them, or else you run the risk of, launching and making zero sales.
Let's talk about validation, because that's a key part of this, right? What is that process? You've got this idea, you want to create this course, maybe you start creating a bit of the content, then you validate. How does that actually work?
Yeah, there's a couple different methods, and it depends a bit on your starting point. So, for example, some people have audiences and some people don't. So you might be like a consultant and you have, some personal contacts, but you may not have a massive email list. Or you could already have an established brand and you have, 20,000 person email list. The process can be a bit different depending on that situation. One good method, which is pretty well structured, is the book Ask by Ryan Levesque. That's a pretty good sort of validation approach to this kind of thing, which can be applied to courses. But the sort of simplified version of what I recommend is to take whatever audience you do have, and also whatever audience you can scrape together, which you can scrape together audiences from scratch, very quickly, because I've actually done this before for clients. They had no audience, no email list whatsoever. And we're like, crap, we got to put together some kind of initial audience to launch this to. There are ways to do that as well, which we could talk about. But essentially, you're going to float this idea past them, right? Start giving them some content, poll them constantly for feedback, find out their biggest pain points, sort of take them through the path of a series of content, which leads into a pitch, which is based on what you've learned by giving out the initial series of content while also getting feedback every step of the way. So, for example, this is kind of similar to the product launch formula type thing. You start giving out pieces of information, which, again, gets feedback at each step, but also sort of hints at the product coming. It gives some major themes, touches on some major pain points, and then it can oftentimes culminate in a webinar. Maybe you JV that webinar if you don't have an audience with another person who has a massive audience, and then all of a sudden you get a bunch of people on it. And then you sort of culminate that series of free content into this like bigger event, which is a webinar. You can sell it on the webinar. You can have a follow-up email sequence. So you can kind of tie in the sort of validation into the launch itself, but it depends on a bit where you are in the process, because ideally you want to validate it before you get that far along.
Okay. Would this apply for somebody who, these are people that I meet quite regularly, who has very specific skills? They may be in the process of launching a business. Their skills may be very domain specific. So for example, they may be, an expert in antiques or jewelry or import export, or they may be an expert in lifestyle, or there's a whole bunch of things that people may have some real skills in which they could sell as a consultant. But then they start thinking about things like courses. For them it seems very attractive because there's an audience out there somewhere, but the challenge is they haven't built that audience yet. They haven't started a newsletter, they don't have a blog or website. Is it possible for somebody like this to look at a course as an option in the near future, or do they have to think about, well, come back, when you have 1,000 on your newsletter?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, it's a little bit more of an uphill battle than if you already have 20,000 person email subscribers, right? That's at that point, it's like almost easy in terms of the launch. It's like an unfair advantage. But a lot of people are in the situation where, again, especially if they're like more of like an old school consultant that does a lot of in-person work, and they're sort of more offline, for example, that's pretty common. And they're like exposed to this new online course thing, and they're like, oh yeah, I want to save my time, right? And package my knowledge up into this kind of product that can sell regardless of what I do with my day, right? So like I said, it's a bit more of a challenge, but it's definitely still possible. It happens all the time. We've worked with a lot of clients who've done that. There's a couple of different approaches you can take. You can take the like quick audience building kind of approach. There's different kinds of marketing strategies you can use that might require maybe a greater budget, but no existing audience. Or you could even just focus on your existing contacts. So again, going back to the consultant example, a lot of times more offline people that are consultants, for example, they have a lot of personal contacts that are very strong, right? They're more offline anyway, so they have lots of in-person contacts. So a lot of those people might have an audience that you could tap into. And then all of a sudden, if you combine all of the audiences of your contacts that are willing to work with you in some way, then all of a sudden you, by extension, have access to a massive audience yourself.
Right. Let's go back to that quick audience building. What exactly was that about? Are you talking about Facebook ads, that kind of thing, or different?
Yeah, there's the paid and the unpaid approach, right? So the paid approach would be something like Facebook ads and the different funnels you can do like that. You could even just set up the webinar and run the Facebook ads to the webinar. And then at the very least, even if you don't make sales, you have the email list, right? So that is one approach. But I know a lot of people aren't super excited about Facebook ads either, because here's another secret. They can be kind of hard to run profitably if that's not your expertise, right? Some people, it might be their expertise, but if it's not, again, that's a whole other skill set you have to either tap into from somebody else or learn yourself. And it's pretty challenging. So there's another approach you can use, which is more from scratch. And one of the biggest wins, again, for that is to tap into other people's audiences. But even just, say you don't even have a website, you can throw up a simple landing page and be like, hey, I'm starting a free newsletter on, founder FM topics or whatever, like whatever you want to call your course, based on your podcast, right? You just throw up a simple landing page. You start floating it around that you're putting together a free newsletter. Maybe you're going to give away some of your episodes for free. And then all of a sudden you start to build your email list. And that can actually happen very, very, very rapidly, like 100 people per day. If you float that in the right places, the right, like Facebook groups, LinkedIn groups, even possibly places like Quora and certain kinds of forums. So, be like, hey, I'm putting out free information, right? And that's actually, the free information is the sort of lead up to eventually you're going to pitch your course, but it's sort of getting people in the door. And it's also a form of validation. Like if you can't get people on your free information email list, then it's not a good sign for people wanting to pay $500 for a paid version of that kind of content.
Right. So the key is you're probably, if you find yourself in that situation where you're putting out free information and people aren't biting, then either your pitch is wrong, i.e. you're packaging that free information wrong, or it's the wrong kind of free information, or it's the wrong kind of people that you're targeting, right? So
exactly.
You can tweak that. So you put the information out there, you start building a newsletter. So you can find out, you get those names, people start signing up for this stuff. People can then build a relationship with you slowly. And one of the things you mentioned, or two of the things you mentioned earlier about what you can do at that point, you can start polling these people, and you can also start doing webinars. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how those things work?
Yeah. So again, one of the things you can do is say you get people onto that initial email list. One of the things that's a really awesome best practice of email marketing is to immediately send them a follow-up email saying, hey, thanks for opting in. We're going to have some awesome materials coming up for you for free on X, Y, and Z. But first, I just want to ask, what's your biggest problem with regards to whatever your topic is, right? And that's, just like hit reply, and I'll read and answer every single email. And then you can just sort of integrate that kind of like feedback loop into every single step, every single piece of information that you send out. You can actually send out surveys. If you just hit them with surveys right away before you know them, before they know you, it's probably not going to work very well. But, as a pre-webinar thing, you can oftentimes use surveys. You can even poll people on webinars, actually, if you have the right setup. So there's a lot of different ways to get the feedback. And the most important thing, beyond like specific tactics for getting feedback, which are useful, but the most important thing is the principle of getting feedback before you put together the course, right? So, for example, even using a free newsletter before launching a course, if you're not sure about the validation aspect, right, it's a lot better to flop on the free newsletter than it is to flop on the course. And so if one of those three categories is off, whether it's the people, the message, or the topic of the course itself, right, you can rectify that while you haven't invested much time or maybe any time and money at all, which is, again, much better than spending 6 months putting together a course, launching it, nothing happens. You want to figure that stuff out up front as much as possible.
Right. Very good point about trying to find out what is the sweet spot where you can get people to validate whilst you do the minimum amount of work possible. And I'm just curious to know what you think that would be, because when people look at courses, they think, wow, that's hours and hours and hours of work and content. And, whether you're doing it for them or whether they're doing it, it's still a lot of work. What's the kind of minimum that you can get out there to test to see if people actually want to pay for this course?
Yeah. I mean, doesn't necessarily have to be an initial course to validate the concept of a course as well. Like, for example, if you are an author and you've successfully sold a book on an existing topic, then you're pretty well validated that people would buy a book on that same topic, right? If somebody's going to spend $10 on a book for a topic and you got lots of great feedback, then there's a good chance you're going to find a certain percentage of those people who are going to spend $100 on a course. Maybe $1,000, it's like maybe less validated for that big of a price difference, but you get the idea, right? And if you're a consultant and you work with lots of clients that you realize their problem could be solved through something that's more automated, like a course, I mean, there's definitely going to be people who want the more hands-on approach of your time, but there's going to be a significant percentage that are interested in taking a course, especially because oftentimes if you're doing one-on-one consulting, it's going to cost a lot more than what a course could be priced at, right? So those are different forms of validation as well. Another approach you can take, and the grain of salt here is that the sort of ecosystem of all of this changes very, very rapidly. So if you're listening to this, 6 months from now, this may be slightly different. But for example, you can make like a mini teaser course and put it up on different course platforms that'll market your course for you. And that can also be used as a form of validation, as a form of getting feedback and improving your materials before you put it out as like your premium flagship sort of offering that you're going to push really hard and put your entire brand behind.
Yes, very good. Okay, so let's talk about what works and what doesn't work in this format. Is there any sort of, how should I put this? Is there any kind of entrepreneurs that work very well with turning their ideas into courses? And are there sort of types that don't work so well, that are a bit more difficult, or maybe their expectations aren't set properly at the beginning?
That's a good question. I haven't been asked that one before.
What do you think? I mean, let me help you out with some examples here. I mean, okay, you mentioned a lawyer. We know who that is, and so taking a lawyer and converting that information like tax law into a course is a fantastic, very niche specific domain, which there's a defined need for it and it's global, right? So that would work very well. But let's say, for example, I'm just something out of the blue here, pet grooming. Let's say I'm a pet grooming consultant. Could I convert that into a course? Or, what happens if I'm a straightforward management consultant? Or, let's say I'm somebody who's interested in import-export of antique guitars, right? Are these things all capable to turn into a course at some point? What works and what doesn't work?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think there are some things that lend themselves more to courses than others. But I'm not sure that there's any. Okay, well, I can think of a couple examples that's like more challenging or less challenging.
Right.
I'm not going to say that like everything will work or, like a specific type of course won't work, because I actually know there are. It might not be pet grooming, but it's like pet training courses that are quite successful. So, for example, there's a pretty big category of courses that's like more academic, right? So you have people that, for example, people come to me and they want to produce a very academic type course. And that's harder to do, at least in a way that you can monetize effectively, because traditionally, like an academic course is going to be very, very narrow in terms of its appeal to people. And oftentimes you're competing with those kinds of institutions that we talked about before that might put out sort of free versions that are close enough to what you're doing that it's going to make it very, very hard to compete with. So if you're putting out a various types of like business courses or like how to make money doing X, Y, Z, right? Like there's not really, that I know of, any Stanford courses that are overlapping with that. So you don't have to even worry about that competition, let alone the fact that like there's a lot of people who still haven't heard of other platforms that feature those kinds of providers. But if you're like, here's how to do algebra, then you have to think, okay, well, who's going to buy this? Why are they going to buy it? How much is it worth to them? Traditional kind of business questions, and really understand the answers, because just because you think it's cool or you think it's valuable doesn't necessarily mean like the market as a whole will find a lot of value in terms of high enough value through the method of a course in order to pay what you're going to ask for it. So, you can just have some hypothetical examples that you say, here's how to start a business, right? You make a how to start a business course. You can't charge $1 million for a how to start a business course, even if ultimately like people could make millions of dollars for it, right? The people's willingness to pay and ability to pay won't be high enough to cover that. Now, if you have like, here's how to learn 6th grade algebra, right? And you're going to try and sell it to 6th graders, like they don't have a budget either. So there's some traditional kind of like product market fit considerations that will apply very much to courses as well. But generally speaking, as long as those like standard business principles are in place, then I would say most things work pretty well for courses, especially if there's other methods of, to use my own tagline, monetizing your expertise, similar to creating a book on a topic, creating a blog on a topic, creating a consulting-based service on a topic. If you can do one of those three things and it's relatively successful, then chances are you can probably do a course on the topic and it'll work as well.
Right. Does it have to be unique? Do you have to have a course which nobody else has done before? Or, does it have to be so niche that, nobody else is able to do this? Or can you go in, like, for example, you mentioned, how to start a business type course. Could you do something like that and make it successful, even though there's probably a lot of those courses out there?
There's so many. I wouldn't suggest starting that or making that exact course, but to answer your broader question, you definitely don't have to be unique. So there's a couple of common hangups people have. One is like, confident enough to make a course. Like I got an email today from somebody saying, man, I've been following your podcast forever and I've gotten so much like inspiration from it, because you definitely spoke to me when you said that like a lot of people are very afraid of like, oh, maybe I'm not quite credible enough to do this, or maybe I'm, maybe I'm not ready. Maybe I need to be like 65 and gray haired and like have hundreds of millions of dollars of proof or whatever. But it doesn't necessarily correlate with making a great course. And the ability to teach and the ability to be an expert in a particular domain, there's two separate things, which is why a lot of times you have professors, right, that are like very, very smart and very, very capable people who can't necessarily do a great job teaching. So there's different kind of skill sets that you have to understand.
Right. Well, I'm curious about that, because one of the challenges that I face, or I see people when I meet who are often, starting out in business, is they often think they're not qualified to do this, right? So often this is, the younger entrepreneurs who have some really interesting skills. They don't see it in themselves that they have a unique skill that they can offer or share, or, maybe a unique way of doing things. And when I suggest to them, hey, look, you need to sell that skill, or you need to teach it, or turn that into a course, for them, it's like the first time anybody's ever said that. And their reaction is often, why me? I'm not the gray-haired professor, right? Yeah. So I'm curious to know how you sort of deal with that, because I think that's a major stumbling block for people. They feel that, that somebody has to pick them to do the course. They have to be qualified to do this, right? How do they pick themselves?
Yeah, well, I think there's a book called Choose Yourself or something like that.
Right.
So read that book maybe. But no, that's a really great question. The concept of like being ready to make a course. And also, again, actually just realized I didn't fully answer your question about the uniqueness of the topic. But yeah, I mean, there's a couple really important points there. So for example, you don't have to be the gray-haired professor, because if you stop and think about it, the gray-haired professor probably wouldn't do a good job of making an online course, right? It's maybe to some extent a little bit more of a young man's game, because it's more, it's only been around for like 10 years, 15 years. So that's an important consideration, is like, are you best set up to make an awesome course, right? The proof is in the pudding. If you can make an awesome course on something, a lot of times that in and of itself is massive boost to your credibility. It's inherently valuable, because people can just see something that's really high quality. And so for example, you could have two people, one person with less experience, one person with more experience. They both make courses. The person with more experience and like quote unquote official credibility makes a really bad course that's not enjoyable. It's really boring. It's poorly put together. It was really half-assed. And then you have the less experienced person who puts together the most amazing course ever. Guess which one people are going to like more, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't matter as much about the official credibility, which is why kind of in some ways this whole online this whole online course space can exist anyways, because, there are the people with the PhDs, some of whom I'm sure could do an amazing job, but some of whom are now having to, in some ways, compete with the fact that like it's open source. If you can do a better job than a person with the PhD, then more power to you. You can now, because there's tools and services and different things to support you to do that. Now, with regards to specifically your question about the uniqueness of the topic, I would say you shouldn't like go take a course and try and make the exact same course, obviously, but there is a lot of room for different types of courses or different like alterations of courses within the same space. Very, very much so. That's why there's so many how to start a successful business type courses, right? There's so many of them because they all have different angles. It's not just like the exact same thing every single time. It's like, here's how to start an agency. Here's how to be a freelancer. Here's how to, program an app. Here's how, there's different types of how to start business courses, for example. And even if you're comparing, and this is actually a real example as well, there's a lot of how to use Facebook ad type courses out there, right? So you might think, well, I definitely can't make a how to make Facebook ad type course because there's so many that exist. And while it's definitely a more competitive space, you can ask yourself some questions to, in a sense, make it unique, even though the broader category of how to use Facebook advertising may not be. So you could say, can I have Facebook advertising for pet groomers, for example? There's probably not a course on that. So if that's a profitable niche, then all of a sudden you have a unique course, even though the core topic might have been done a lot in different angles for different people.
For sure. There you go. There's an idea there off the bat already. So I think the key as well is that, you talk about unique angles, and one of the things we talked about was picking yourself, choosing yourself. I often think that one of the great ways for an entrepreneur to identify, what is their unique angle is to say, what are the questions that people are asking me already? Even though I might not have a business yet or might not have a course, people are coming to me and asking me for stuff. You may be the guy that's fixing everybody's iPhone, right? Or you may be the person that everybody's coming to ask about pet grooming or about tax advice, right? So, whether you're charging for this or not, it already identifies, where is the market pulling you in a certain direction, right? So if that's already happening, that's often the best place to start, is to say, hey, look, people already see me as this person. I'm the go-to guy for that, right? So if you're a go-to person for something, and I'm sure everybody has something which people ask you about, right? Then that's obviously a good starting point for identifying what your unique angle may be. So, you could then go back to the Facebook ad course and then think, what's the angle here that I can give this a unique spin, which the other guys can't do, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I gotta say, in my own experience, 100% of the things, like I've tried lots of different things, right, in my entrepreneurial journey, but the things that have stuck have all fallen into that category of it kind of just like clicks with people. They kind of ask you for it already without even trying to push it on them. It just sort of falls into place, and you just it's like an opportunity that's like put in front of you. It's like people ask you for help for a specific thing very consistently, right? So those types of things have always been the things that worked out best for me. Even if I tried to like work really hard on something that I thought was cool, but nobody else did. It was an uphill battle. And then all of a sudden it sort of clicks into place if you can find the kind of category that you're talking about. And to make it a little bit more formalized in terms of how you can make something unique, even if it's a traditionally like overcrowded course ecosystem, for example. Two really easy ways to switch it up are, as we said, Facebook ads for pet grooming, for example. So the market it's for can be different. You can take the same course and gear it towards a different group of people. Maybe it's like offline businesses. That's a common thing that people do, is take something that's geared towards online businesses and put it towards offline businesses in like Denver, for example. It's a very common strategy, and it works really, really, really well because that market's not well addressed. And then another approach you can use as well, just to give you another category that you can think about, is the level of difficulty. So for example, there might be a lot of like beginner Facebook ad courses, but are there any advanced ones? Are there any like advanced, so you can specifically do this one very specific thing? Those are different ways to differentiate yourself, even if the core topic is very much competitive.
Great advice there. Let's talk about the challenges now that people may face in building a course. So it's not all straightforward. They have to understand and set the expectations earlier on. What are the biggest challenges that people face, not just with building courses with you, Grant, but generally when it comes to courses?
Yeah, there's definitely a couple main categories, and we've kind of hinted at some, at least. So oftentimes what happens is people, it's like floated out there like, hey, you should make a course, right? And I very much advocate that for most, or a lot of businesses, because, maybe I'm biased, but I've found it very useful. But also I try and be very realistic about it. So sometimes people sort of oversimplify it in their head, or maybe the channel that they heard about it from, and they're like, oh, this is going to be easy. I just have to make some slides and, like plug in my headphones and talk over some slides. This should be simple. And, it doesn't have to be impossible or massively complex. There's a lot of great ways to make it a lot simpler. However, as we talked about, there are a lot of moving parts, and you have to understand that from the get-go. But what happens is people sit down, they say, I want to make a course. I want to make that pet grooming course. And they're like, cool, I'm so excited. I'm going to have this topic in it, and it's going to be about this and that and this. It's funny, actually, when I get on calls with people who are like, hey, I'm excited to make this course, they'll spend like 20 minutes, without taking a breath, telling me all the intricate details of what they want to teach in their course, without ever addressing like, well, should you make this course, or is it just something that you're excited about? And also, so that's the validation thing that we've already talked about. But the other category as well is like, okay, cool, this sounds like an awesome course. What happens once you make it? How are you actually going to sell it so it's a viable element of your business? So those are really big categories of things that people overlook. And there's even courses on courses that never actually really fully talk about what to do once you make the course. So it's a big oversight that you have to think about all these things from the beginning. And I know that it can feel overwhelming, which is why people don't. They get very hung up on like one step at a time. But sometimes it's in the wrong order. So they build it and then they're like, oh, wait, I should validate it. And then it's too late. So it's important to check the boxes as you begin a project like this, so you don't waste 6 months of your time.
Right. And when you do build this course, the ongoing maintenance of the course, what sort of things will the course owner be involved in? What do they need to know that, in terms of time and ongoing money and so on? Is there an ongoing maintenance aspect to it, or can they just kind of set and forget a course?
It depends on your marketing strategy. So, for example, a lot of, it essentially comes down to two camps. You've got the like evergreen model and the like launch and close model, which, different people use different models, where it's like the big course launch and 3 months later they do it again, right? That's more of a hands-on kind of active approach. They'll do a lot of different webinars. They'll maybe go do the podcast rounds. They'll like really hit it hard very actively. And so maybe that model, you're not maintaining it all the time, but you do have to at least periodically spend time to market it, to relaunch it. And then you've got the evergreen model, which sometimes if you want it at a high level can take a bit longer in terms of trial and error to get it running. But then, of course, by the definition of the word evergreen, it's pretty automated. It's pretty standardized. There's really cool tricks you can do. Like, for example, if you're getting a lot of like student questions, like, hey, I'm having problems with X, Y, and Z, right? Like, of course, you can hire an easy, cheap VA to take care of that, or you can just have an FAQ that answers all their questions and like an automated email response that directs them to the FAQ. So then you don't even get support requests. There's a lot of things, like a lot of specific tricks that you can do like that. But basically, the whole concept of a course is to free up your time. So if that is your goal, it's important to keep that in mind as well. So you don't tie yourself into like, oh no, I was trying to free up my time, but now I have to like spend all my time on this course, right? So that's another important consideration up front, is what level of automation do you want? And how do you prioritize that against like overall earnings? Because oftentimes there's kind of a clash of interest there, because more automated can sometimes mean less overall earnings, but maybe a better lifestyle. So it's kind of a personal decision.
Right. But that's a decision. That's the key here, isn't it? It's, you find your Goldilocks zone in building this course, right? Is it just right here? Maybe less automation, more income, and so on. But it's not like you're given one option for designing a course, right? You can design a course around your business and lifestyle needs, and that's a key part of it, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that's maybe where people run into trouble, is that like it's a very flexible thing, and that gives you lots of optionality, but it also can make it a bit challenging because people are just like, how do I do it? I don't know how to do it, because there's so many options, right?
Is there a course that you've seen that's really, doesn't necessarily have to be one that has gone through, your system and with monetize your expertise, but is there a course you've seen out there which is pretty successful? You thought, wow, how did anybody come up with this idea for a course that's really surprised you? Maybe give us a feel for what kind of things are out there in the course world.
Oh, that's a really good question.
Pet grooming.
There is an actual course that's like, it's about pets. I forget exactly what about pets.
Right.
But it's like, I think it's training. There's different brands that have pet training products,
right?
Courses. There's so many. Oh, actually, no. There's. I'm in a mastermind where a woman. There's actually two people in my mastermind that have interesting courses. One is very, very, very specific, and it's super interesting the way she markets it as well, and it's super, super successful. I forget exactly the numbers, but it's like, I don't know, like in the 5 digits per month kind of range USD. But she's Chinese, and she sells a course that helps Chinese students get Australian residency and get into Australian colleges. Like just that very specific thing. Yeah. So that's an example of like super, super niche, but it's also super, super profitable because, I'm not sure how worldly the person listening is right now, but like, obviously China has a lot of money and is increasing very, very quickly. And so all the upper class students, they maybe want to go to Australia, and so they have a lot of money from their families to throw at it. So she's just like collecting checks left and right.
Exactly.
So whatever.
And it's very, very defined goal that you get out of it as well, which is really interesting, isn't it? You do this course, you get this.
Yeah, absolutely. And another example as well within the same mastermind, funny enough, is a course on playing the violin, and it's very successful as well. So like as we talked about, there's a lot of different things you can make courses on, and you could even think about like, why would you suspect those would work? Well, people pay for violin lessons in person. That's pretty good validation. People pay for different test prep services. I'm sure there's like, sort of manual one-on-one guidance people that people hire to help them get into Australian colleges from China. So those are kinds of things that are like, could we package this up and make it as a course? Turns out you can.
Exactly. And also things that people get emotional about, aren't they? I mean, people love music, people love playing music. The people who love violins, and people who don't. But those that do really love it, right? And for those Chinese kids that want to go to Australia, that's all a lifestyle thing. That's about their dreams and achieving their life goals and so on, right? It's a very emotional thing. These are the things that do really well in courses that sometimes people think, oh, no, I didn't think you could make money out of that. Going back to the pet grooming, I know we laughed at it.
They love their pets.
They love their pets. So they spend a lot of money on this stuff, right? So, it's not a commodity. I think once you sort of get into the commodity areas, then it's difficult to monetize it. But if you find niches, like for me, it would be cycling. People spend crazy money on cycling, right? You could do a course on cycling. Wow. There you go.
I know a guy who has like a super, super, super niche cycling. It's like a high-end racing wheel manufacturers for like pro cyclists or something. And it's like these like crazy high-end carbon fiber wheel things that he ships around the world. And that's not something I would ever not a market I would ever confidently try and sell to. But, people who are cyclists, especially professional ones, they're like really into it. They spend a ton of money on it. And so it's wildly successful. Exactly.
And a course would probably be cheaper than one of those wheels, right? So
there you go. So learn how to cycle better.
Exactly. Well, that's been fantastic. It's been really insightful. And, I think you've given us a lot of ideas, Grant. Where do we find out more about you and monetize your expertise and also the world of courses?
Yeah, so you can go to myepodcast.com. It's a little easy to type redirect. That'll go to my podcast page where there's a lot of different interviews with various course creators, different founders of online course platforms, like Summit, Evergreen, Teachable, etc. So you can learn more from the people who are like all kinds of people who are really in tune with these kinds of markets and products from a variety of angles. And so you can also, from that page, get in touch with me. There's a contact us page. And if you are interested in turning something that you already have, if you're interested in monetizing your own expertise through your book, your consultancy, your podcast, your blog, etc., go forth and check out the contact page on the site.
Excellent. Grant, it's been great having you on. Thank you for sharing your insights and sharing your time with us today.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me on. I hope everybody listening found a ton of value.
Founder FM, voice of the entrepreneur. Find out more at www.founder